The storm announced itself long before it arrived, whispering through the barren winter plains with an unsettling chill that even seasoned ranchers didn't ignore. Elias Ward felt it before he saw it, a shift in the air, the kind that made horses twitch and old bones ache. He tugged his coat tighter and leaned forward in the saddle as he made his way back toward his ranch after a supply trip to town. He knew winter storms could turn vicious in minutes, but this one carried a sense of urgency, as though the land itself were bracing for something far worse. By the time Elias reached the halfway mark of the trail, the wind had picked up enough to sting his face like 1,000 needle pricks. The sky, once a dull silver, thickened into a low, oppressive blanket of dark clouds. Snow began falling lightly, swirling in lazy circles at first, then harder. Driven sideways by the rising gale, Elias muttered under his breath, not in fear, but in frustration. He had hoped to be home long before weather like this hit. The storm was moving faster than he'd anticipated not far up the trail. Clara Halle struggled with her own misfortune. She had set out that morning with optimism and determination, eager to reach the small frontier town where she would begin her new life as a schoolteacher. The wagon she'd hired was old but serviceable until an unexpected dip in the Mendada. Frosted road snapped a wheel clean in half. The noise had startled her horses, and though she managed to calm them, the damage was done. She was stranded, hours from town. With no experience navigating the harsh wilderness alone at first, Clara tried to stay with the wagon, pulling blankets around her shoulders and whispering reassurances to herself. She had been raised to handle adversity with grace and composure. But as the storm intensified, those virtues began to feel terribly small. Snow piled around the broken wheel and crept under the wagon's floorboards. The wind tore at her hat and clothing. Visibility dropped until the world was little more than a blur of white and moving shadows. Panic tugged sharply at her chest finally, as the wagon shuddered under the force of the blizzard. Clara realized staying put would mean freezing before anyone found her. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, grabbed her small travel bag, and stepped out into the raging storm. But the cold was unlike anything she had ever known. It clawed at her skin, stole her breath, and made every step feel like wading through wet sand within minutes. She was disoriented, unable to distinguish trail from drifts. Elias spotted the faint shape in the snow only because his horse hesitated, ears flicking toward the movement. At first, he thought it might be an animal, but as he rode closer, the shape resolved into a woman stumbling forward, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her steps uneven and weakening the moment Clara collapsed onto her hands and knees. Elias kicked his horse into a quick trot. "Hey, easy now," he called over the wind, sliding off the saddle. He reached her just as she pitched sideways into the snow. Clara blinked up at him, her lips blue, her breath shallow. "You're freezing," Elias said, his voice rough but urgent. Without waiting for permission, he lifted her into his arms and settled her onto his horse, wrapping his coat around her trembling form. "There's a trapper's cabin not far from here. We'll make it." He mounted behind her, holding her steady as the blizzard swallowed them both. The cabin was their only shot at surviving the storm now roaring across the plains, and neither of them knew how much it would change their lives. Trapper's cabin stood half buried in snow, its roof sagging under thick drifts, its shutters rattling like loose bones in the wind. Elias had remembered it from years ago, a place old trappers used during long hunting seasons, but even he wasn't sure what condition it would be in after so many winters. Still, the faint outline of the structure was a welcome sight in the endless white. With Clara leaning weakly against him, he coaxed his horse through the last few yards and carried her inside. The door groaned open with a reluctant shriek, letting in a swirl of ice that quickly died in the stale air. The interior was dim and cold, lit only by gray daylight filtering through the cracks between the boards. Dust blanketed the shelves, and a brittle silence hung over everything. Elias wasted no time. He laid Clara on the small bunk against the wall, then knelt by the stone hearth to spark a fire. His hands moved with practiced urgency, striking flint, gathering old wood scraps, coaxing flame from stubborn embers. Soon a flickering warmth spread across the room, chasing away shadows and giving the cabin a fragile sense of life. Clara stirred as the heat reached her. Her eyelashes trembling with the effort of waking Elias handed her a tin cup of warm melted snow. Watching carefully as she sipped beneath his concern was a discomfort he tried to hide. He wasn't used to company, much less the responsibility of a stranger's well-being. He had lived most of his adult life avoiding entanglements, but here, in a storm that made the world disappear, choices were limited. Clara, though grateful, found herself equally uneasy. She had always prided herself on her polite manners and calm demeanor, but the situation was far outside anything she had been prepared for. Sharing a cramped, rustic cabin with a rugged cowboy she had just met felt both strangely safe and terrifyingly vulnerable. Still, she managed a quiet, "Thank you for finding me." Elias grunted, not unkindly, but kept his attention on tending the fire. "Storm's getting worse. We'll be here a while." As if on cue, the wind slammed against the cabin walls, making them shudder. Clara flinched. Elias glanced over his shoulder. "You're safe here," he said, more gently this time. "Cabin's old, but it'll hold." That reassurance, simple as it was, eased some of the tightness in her chest. Once she regained enough strength, Clara insisted on helping. She gathered snow in a small pot to melt for drinking water and tried to organize the supplies scattered on a shelf. Elias found her efforts unnecessary, bordering on troublesome, but he held his tongue. He couldn't deny he admired her determination. Most people would have curled up under blankets and waited for the storm to claim them, but Clara moved with a quiet purpose, as though activity was her way of keeping fear at bay. Despite their efforts to maintain personal space, the cabin was simply too small. Elias brushed past her when gathering firewood. Clara stepped aside awkwardly, murmuring apologies. Their different worlds collided in small, clumsy ways, her tidy habits and soft-spoken words against his blunt instructions and broad, work-roughened movements. Yet something subtle began to take shape. Cooperation born not of choice but necessity. When the fire began sputtering, Clara held the tinder while Elias blew gently onto the embers. Their heads nearly touched. Clara felt a flutter of nerves, not from fear but from unexpected awareness. Elias felt it too, though he masked it behind his usual stern expression later. As night crept in and the storm continued to batter the cabin, they settled into an uneasy rhythm. Clara wrapped herself in blankets on the bunk, while Elias stretched out on the floor near the hearth. The glow of firelight flickered over them, casting their features into soft relief. Outside, the world was chaos and cold. Inside, two strangers shared the fragile warmth of a shelter that forced them closer physically, emotionally, and in ways neither yet understood. By the time the second day dawned, though dawn was a generous word for the dim, storm-muted light creeping into the cabin, Elias and Clara had exhausted most of the tasks that kept their hands busy and their thoughts occupied. The fire crackled steadily, the cracks in the walls were patched as well as they could manage, and their meager supplies were organized. With nothing left to do but wait out the blizzard, the silence inside the small cabin became something alive, pressing them into unavoidable closeness. Clara sat near the small window, her fingers tracing the frost patterns forming on the glass. She tried reading from a little book she carried in her travel bag, but the trembling of the cabin and the relentless howling outside made concentration difficult. Elias, meanwhile, sharpened his knife with deliberate focus, the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone the only sound between them. Hours passed like this, quiet, tense, each trying not to intrude on the other's presence. But something had shifted since the night before. Clara caught herself watching Elias work. Noticing how his hands moved with a kind of unspoken confidence, how his brow furrowed in concentration, how his jaw tightened whenever the wind howled particularly fiercely. He seemed carved from the wilderness itself, rugged, solitary, dependable in ways she had never encountered. Elias, for his part, found himself glancing toward Clara more often than he liked to admit. She was unlike the people he normally crossed paths with, gentle in manner, careful in her speech, but possessing a surprising steel beneath her calm exterior. He had expected her to collapse into panic or helpless grief once the immediate danger passed. Instead, she carried herself with quiet resilience. Her courage was softer than his, but no less real. Eventually, the silence became too heavy to ignore. "You said you were headed to teach," Elias remarked, barely lifting his eyes from the knife. "Most folks wouldn't travel alone in winter." Clara closed the book gently. "I didn't expect a storm like this. The man who drove my wagon said the weather was clear." She hesitated, then added, "It felt important to start as soon as possible. Fresh beginnings don't wait." The way she said it carried more weight than the words alone revealed. Elias sensed it. Though he didn't press her, he wasn't the type to pry. People either talked or they didn't. Still, her voice held an ache that lingered later as they shared a simple meal of broth and hard biscuits. Clara surprised herself by speaking more openly. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the storm, the sense that the whole world had shrunk to this small circle of firelight. "I left behind an engagement," she said quietly. "He was a good man in many ways, but not the right man. I suppose he saw me as something delicate, decorative." She gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "I wanted a life with purpose, one where I mattered." Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once solemnly. "Takes grit to walk away from what's expected of you." Clara looked at him, surprised she hadn't expected kindness or understanding from someone as stern as him. "What about you?" she asked gently. "Why live out here alone?" The question struck deeper than she intended. Elias stiffened slightly, eyes shifting toward the fire. A long silence followed, filled only by the creak of the cabin settling under snow. "Lost family long time ago," he finally said. "Storm took the roof, took them too." His voice was flat, but something fragile flickered behind it. After that, felt easier to stay away from folks. Clara's heart tightened. She didn't offer empty condolences. Something told her he wouldn't want them. Instead, she simply whispered, "I'm sorry truly." For the first time since they'd met, Elias met her eyes without walls between them. In that shared look, something thawed slowly, quietly, like ice giving way to spring. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was changing. The cold space between two strangers was beginning to warm by the third day. The blizzard had shifted from raging chaos to a heavy, smothering presence. The wind still howled, but the snow had settled into thick layers that threatened to swallow the cabin entirely. The situation grew more urgent when Elias stepped outside to check the roof and discovered it sagging dangerously under the weight. If they didn't act soon, the roof could collapse and the storm would finish what it started. Elias re-entered the cabin, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Roof's too heavy, we need to clear it." His voice held no dramatics, but the tension in his jaw told Clara everything she needed to know. Clara's instinctive fear rose like a tide going out into that storm again, but she saw the seriousness in his expression, the kind that didn't leave room for hesitation. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, surprising even herself with how steady her voice sounded. Elias gave a curt nod, as though he had expected resistance but respected her willingness. They bundled themselves in every layer they could find: coats, scarves, blankets wrapped under jackets. Clara's breath fogged instantly as they stepped outside, and the cold bit so sharply it felt like stepping into a world made of knives. Roof was only reachable with an old wooden ladder half buried in snow. Elias dug it out and tested it with his boot. "I'll go up," he said. You keep the ladder steady. Clara planted her feet firmly. Gripping the icy rungs with numb fingers, Elias climbed with the sure movements of someone who knew danger intimately. Once on the roof, he used a shovel to heave heavy slabs of snow down to the ground. Clara pulled them away from the cabin, pushing with all the strength her numbed arms allowed. At one point, the wind gusted so violently that the ladder wobbled. Clara instinctively threw her weight forward. Keeping it upright, Elias paused, looking down with widened eyes before nodding in approval. Good reflexes. He called over the storm. Clara managed a breathless smile. I'm learning. As they worked, an unspoken trust formed. Elias relied on Clara's steadiness, and Clara relied on Elias's strength and experience. They moved with a kind of silent coordination, a rhythm born from necessity but deepened by growing respect. When Elias was nearly finished, he shifted his weight to reach a stubborn chunk of frozen snow. The board beneath him groaned ominously before he could react. It cracked with a sharp, splintering sound. Elias dropped to one knee, sliding dangerously toward the edge of the roof. Elias! Clara shouted, lunging forward to brace the ladder and reach up instinctively. Though he was far above her grasp, Elias managed to stop himself. Gripping the shovel handle, jammed into the snow. For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath around them. Clara's face was pale with fear, her gloved hands clenched tight. With effort, Elias crawled back to stable footing. He exhaled heavily, more shaken than he let on when he climbed down. At last, Clara didn't step back as she usually did. Instead, she reached out and laid a hand on his arm, grounding him. You could have fallen, she said softly. He looked down at her hand, then at her face. But I didn't, thanks to you. It wasn't just acknowledgement, it was gratitude. Sincere and rare. Back inside the cabin, dripping snow onto the floor. They sat near the fire to warm up. Silence filled the space again, but it was different now, less strained, more companionable. Steam rose from their clothes as the fire thawed them. Clara wrapped her hands around a cup of warm broth Elias prepared. I didn't think I'd be able to help, she admitted. Not in this kind of weather. Elias shrugged gently. You're stronger than you think. She looked at him then fully and saw the hint of a smile tugging at his usually serious features. It was small, fleeting, but it was real. Outside, the storm still roared, but inside, they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer just two strangers forced into survival. They were partners in the struggle, bound by effort, fear, relief, and something deeper still, something neither dared name yet. By the fourth night, the blizzard had begun to lose some of its fury, but the cold that followed in its wake was sharper, more dangerous, more absolute. It was the kind of cold that turned breath into brittle crystals and crept into bones even through thick blankets. Elias knew the signs well. This was the final blow of a dying storm, the kind that claimed lives not with wind, but with silence and freezing air. Inside the cabin, the fire struggled. No matter how much wood Elias fed it, the flames burned low, flickering more than roaring. Clara sat close to the hearth, rubbing her hands together, trying to chase the numbness from her fingertips. Even bundled in every layer they owned, she shivered uncontrollably. Elias crouched beside the fire, frustration tightening his muscles. Wood's too damp, he muttered. Won't burn hot enough. Clara's teeth chattered as she whispered, Will the fire last through the night? He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation said enough. They were running out. Of warmth, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the hiss of weak flames. Clara watched Elias quietly, noticing the strain etched across his face. He had carried them through this storm, found her, saved her, protected her. But even he couldn't fight the cold alone. What do we do? She finally asked, voice barely audible. Elias met her eyes, steady and honest. We stay close as possible, share what heat we've got. It's the only way. The words hung between them, intimate and frightening in their practicality. Clara felt her cheeks warm despite the freezing air. Part of her wanted to shrink. back from the vulnerability the moment demanded. But another part deeper and braver trusted him completely. Elias spread the blankets on the bunk, layering them carefully. He lay on one side, leaving space for her, but giving her the choice. Clara approached slowly, her heart pounding not from fear but from the weight of the moment. She lay beside him, leaving a small gap between them. "That won't work," he said softly. Almost apologetically, Clara exhaled shakily and shifted closer until their bodies touched, hesitant at first. Then naturally, instinctively, Elias wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against him. The warmth that spread through her was startling, comforting, and deeply human. For a while, neither spoke. The storm outside faded into the distance, replaced by the sound of two hearts gradually sinking into a steady rhythm. Clara felt safe, warmer than she'd been in days, but what surprised her most was how peaceful she felt in the circle of his arm. Eventually, her voice broke the silence, soft as falling snow. "I didn't think I'd see another sunrise." Elias's grip tightened protectively. "You will, I promise." There was no bravado in his voice, only sincerity. Carved from the hardships he'd lived through, Clara turned slightly, enough to see his face in the dim firelight. "You've carried so much alone," she whispered. "You don't have to." "You know, not always," he blinked. Caught off guard by the gentleness of her words, "It's easier that way, for surviving." "Maybe," she said softly, "but not for living." Something unspoken passed between them, recognition, understanding. A fragile but undeniable connection forged through fear and trust. Elias had never allowed anyone close enough to speak into the quiet wounds he carried. Yet Clara, with her steady courage and open heart, had found a way past defenses he thought impenetrable. He surprised himself by admitting, "I didn't realize how much I missed having someone beside me." Clara's breath hitched, not in fear, but in aching sympathy, "and I didn't realize how strong I could be until all this happened." They lay together in warmth created by shared vulnerability rather than fire. The storm had taken so much comfort, safety, certainty, but in stripping away the world outside, it had revealed the truth inside them both. As Clara drifted toward sleep, she whispered, "Elias, whatever happens after this, glad I found you." His reply was quiet, almost reverent. "Me too." Outside, the night was merciless. Inside, something tender and fragile bloomed, stronger than the cold, stronger than fear, a bond born not from chance, but from survival, honesty, and the quiet courage of two hearts thawing together. Morning arrived quietly, with a faint silver light leaking through the gaps in the cabin walls. The silence felt different, lighter, less oppressive, as if the storm had finally taken its last breath. Elias woke first, out of habit formed over years of cautious living. For a moment, he forgot where he was, who lay beside him, but then he felt Clara's slow, steady breathing against his chest, and the memories of the night returned with surprising warmth. Carefully, so as not to wake her, he shifted and sat up. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, but the cabin wasn't as deathly cold as the night before. Clara stirred, blinking sleepily, her hair falling loose around her face. When she looked up at Elias, there was no awkwardness, no sudden pulling away, just a soft understanding between them. "Is the storm over?" she asked, her voice still husky with sleep. Elias nodded. "Think so. Looks calm out there." Calm was an understatement when Clara stepped outside with him. Wrapped tightly in blankets, she felt her breath catch not from cold but from the sheer beauty around them. The world had been transformed into a glittering white landscape. Snow blanketed the hills in untouched waves, reflecting sunlight like shards of crystal. The sky, after days of turmoil, stretched in a clear blue arc that felt almost surreal. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there, side by side, two survivors in a world reborn by frost. Elias broke the silence first. "We can head Out once the horses rested should be a half-day to town, Clara nodded, though her chest ached strangely at the thought of leaving the cabin, the place that had nearly killed them but had also changed everything. It had been a prison, a shelter, and something else entirely. The space where two strangers became something more inside. They prepared to leave, packing what little remained of their supplies. Elias moved with his usual quiet efficiency, but Clara noticed the subtle gentleness in his gestures now, the way he placed her gloves by the fire to warm them, the way he glanced at her as if to reassure himself she was really there when everything was ready. Clara paused at the door and looked around the small, rough interior. "It feels strange," she murmured, "as if we're leaving behind more than just shelter." Elias met her gaze. The truth of her words reflected in his eyes. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, nor one who spoke deeply without reason. But this moment felt like a crossroads, one he didn't want to lose to silence. "Clara," he began slowly, "what happened here, it wasn't just the storm, you understand that, don't you?" She smiled softly. "I do." They saddled the horse and set off. Moving carefully through the thick snow, the world was quiet except for the steady crunch of hooves and the occasional whisper of wind as they traveled. Clara found herself riding closer to Elias than necessary, drawn by the comfort of his presence. He didn't pull away. Instead, he adjusted his pace to match her stride. When the road widened and the roofs of the distant town came into view, Clara felt a pang of uncertainty. What happened now? Would this connection dissolve once they stepped back into their separate lives? Or had the storm forged something lasting? Perhaps Elias sensed her hesitation, because he turned slightly toward her. "Once we get you settled at the schoolhouse," he paused, clearing his throat. "I was thinking I might stay in town a while, got no urgent reason to head back yet." It was the closest thing to an invitation he'd ever spoken, and Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest. "I'd like that," she said, "very much." As they entered the outskirts of town, the world felt bigger again, full of noise and life and responsibilities. But the bond formed in the storm didn't fade, it lingered between them, quiet but steady, like a flame that had learned how to survive the coldest night, whatever waited ahead. Uncertainty, new beginnings, or the slow, cautious growth of love. They would face it not as strangers crossing paths by chance, but as two souls who had weathered the worst together and found something beautiful in the wreckage.